Welcome back to the Redacted Culture Cast. If you are watching on YouTube, you will notice that the setting is quite different. The background that we have been putting together, or I have been putting together, when I say we, I mean my family and I, is directed so that I can do a little bit more content for you related on equipment. Which brings up the question of today. Can you fix a skill issue with better gear? Now, while there seems to be a kind of meta answer to this, a big world attempt at saying, well, of course, no, you can't, but only to some extent, I want to address some of the nuances of this conversation, particularly in the way that it impacts gun culture. And to no one's surprise, we're going to be talking a little bit about ego. But before we do that, and before we get too far into today's episode, I want to bring up Obsidian Arms because they have been generous and kind to sponsor this show. They know that you are the minds and eyes of gun culture and that your participation in our community doesn't come without some investment. And so they have invested into the Redacted Culture Cast, and I have a couple of things that I've used from them lately, which they did send, including one of these AR-15 toolkits, as well as a punch set. Now, in the background here are a series of AR-15 and similar or even AK-style firearms that I have been able to, use their tools to assemble better. And when I say better, let me put it this way. If you've worked at a gun store that sells these types of firearms, or you have been in the community and heard these kinds of sighs of exasperation when a spring goes launching into the ether, you know what I'm talking about. And the amount of time invested, your time being valuable, lost because the pin or spring ends up somewhere where you can't find it, and thus you have to make the shameful trip to the local gun store to try to replace just a single pin. I have a remedy for that in the long term that is for you. Is it from me? No, it is from Obsidian Arms. So their toolkit, particularly this gray one built around the AR-15, is an excellent option for any of you who are either working on your own equipment for your own self-sufficiency or whether you are taking that into the professional realm. Their toolkits, they come with a lifetime warranty. So if you break, bend, or damage any single one of those, you can send that piece back to them and they will replace it for free. And if any of you have the reputation like I have where you tend to break things a little bit, that's a huge plus. And beyond that, though, chances are if you open up your safe or you go into your room where you store your guns and you look at all the parts that kind of go into your different builds, chances are you might find something that you did not know was manufactured by Obsidian Arms. That is another service that they offer this community and this industry. So if you are trying to make your way into the industry side of our big tent community, then now is a good chance. Go over to Obsidian Arms at obsidianarms.com. So, to the topic of today's show, can you solve a skill issue with better gear? I asked this question on Instagram, which has been aggressively censoring us as of late, so much so that I've found people cannot DM me about upcoming public land cleanups, or they can't even reach out in any other meaningful way, so they've had to reach out to our email. You can get there at redactedllc.com. And the question, though, that was asked, and it did get a fair amount of responses, was this very same. Can you solve a skill issue with gear? And boy, did we get a foray of answers. The answers that were the result of the community ranged from absolute yes to absolute no. And of course, if we take a minute to pull back from the drama of similar types of questions, we'll very reasonably get to that question of kind of depends on what you're doing. For example, there really is no skill issue that goes into jumping out of an airplane that can replace a good parachute. At the same time, just because your rifle shoots sub-MOA accuracy doesn't mean you're going to win every competition against the guy who's got a clapped-out Palmetto State Armory. Shout out to them, by the way, because they have been supporting some of our public land cleanups. If you want to come out to one, you can shoot this jackal that's behind me. I bring it out every chance I get, and I've been very happy with it. Shout out to, oh wait, can you even shout out yourself? I'll be putting out a video on this channel soon comparing the Palmetto State Armory Jackal to a BRN 180 by Brownells. But that what do you want to call it? Self-promotion illustrates the point. If you look at the kind of language that goes around competitive video games like Call of Duty with its Warzone launch or similar kinds of games, you'll be looking for the meta. You want to find out what is it that's currently available in the game that's going to give you the best possible edge. Now, if that's not simply enough of a demonstration, just because you have the best guns doesn't mean that you will be the winner. And the real world somehow actually gets to reflect this in our life. Just because you have the best equipment, the top plate carriers, or the perfect scopes and so on and so forth, we know intuitively that that does not exactly make us the best. But we are met with a problem. How come then all of the top competitors and most of the top performers in the world all tend to use the same gear? Is it something about the gear that makes them good? Or is it something about them, their quality, their skill, that helps them select the gear? Now, if you've spent time in the military and you've been around the kind of AR-15 conversation for some time, you'll know that mil-spec isn't always what it's cracked up to be. I have said this before, and I will say it again. On my first deployment as a Ranger, my M4 was about a 3-minute of angle barrel. And now, today, you can buy a what would be considered lower tier AR that is considerably more accurate than that clapped out Colt. So, what does this mean? Why do we bring up all of these fields of information, all this data and all these kind of arguments that come into the gear versus skill argument? Certainly, we know, and if we're going to kind of draw these things in a spectrum, on the one hand, we have what we would call mission essential gear. We'll go back to the parachuting example, or something like scuba diving, or something like, winning a motorcycle race. You're going to need to have the equipment that gets you across the finish line. It's hard to win a motorcycle race if you don't have a motorcycle. But the skill and development that goes into winning a motorcycle race also might include some of that gear selection. So if we are going to say on the one end, mission essential gear is going to be an absolute yes in certain scenarios, given our certain situations, like if you're going to take a round, it'd be better to be wearing a plate carrier, or if you're using let's just say, a firearm that is only capable of being accurate out to 200 meters, and you're up against an adversary that has a rifle that can reach out to 1,200 meters. Wow, I almost said 12,000. That would have been rough. Then you'd think the individual with the better equipment would be expected to do better. But in today's timeline, we have no need to look any further back than the first attempted assassination of Donald Trump that was televised, which took place, on the 15th? Don't even have my watch on. And on that event, at least the narrative that fits in our current day, at the time of recording, the defense of the former president included people using a 300 Win Mag rifle that was very, very accurate. Whereas the attempted assassin was using an AR-15 that has been at this time reported to be Panther Arms? What was the name of that company? Oh, yeah, it was the same one that was used in the Sandy Hook shooting, if I'm not mistaken. Man, it's got to be a rough time to be DPMS. I don't think they're in existence anymore. So in this scenario that we're talking about around the attempted assassination of Donald Trump, we do see that being illustrated. There is more that comes into effect. Now, even in that scenario, we probably wouldn't chalk it up to a skill issue, though, because it wasn't really skill about the two. that the skill levels of the two peoples stated, one being the attempted assassin and the other one being the Secret Service, there seemed to be something else at play in that scenario. But if we were to try to build a spectrum of what we're observing, we might get to the other end, which would be superfluous gear that might make our lives more comfortable, but doesn't necessarily fix a skill issue. Now, if you want me to get kind of comical and crass on it, I'll bring up something like a dump pouch. A dump pouch doesn't necessarily make you a better shooter. It's not designed to just hold your magazines in place when you are sprinting and running. It is not a tool, a piece of equipment that you put on your gear that really is a performance-based piece of equipment. It might be best described as a quality of life piece of equipment. But you say, isn't quality of life, doesn't that contribute to our overall readiness and skill? Yes, and let me get to that in a minute. And so in these kinds of gear, there are certain types of gear that we buy, that we spend money on, that we're issued, that we put onto our kit, that we work with or train with or don't train with, and so on and so forth, that oftentimes catches the attention of others as being superfluous. So let me make an intermission here, an interlude for you. I'm going to come back to this at the end, but this is where this comes to play. There really are only two types of people in the world who care about your gear and the gear that you're using. One of them is your friends, and they are the people who have your best interest in mind. They might say, hey, buddy, I know what you got there is great or is working for you, but that might be something worth replacing. Or if you're in a professional environment, a tactical team or something like that, where the failures in your equipment might come at the cost of other people's lives, then you have a second form of investment involved. Not to be mistaken with the first, or the second group of people, and that is the haters. So let's go back to this kind of conversation on gear. If you are not wearing the right shoes and you're tasked with running a 5-mile run, you might be able to muscle through it. Some people can, some people can't. And in this kind of scenario, we are looking at what would be an expected performance level and something that's weighing you down, holding you back. If you are expected to run a 5-mile and you are fully capable of doing this in a PT uniform and running shorts and running shoes and a lightweight shirt so that your perspiration cools you off, you might find yourself not running as quickly if you have to wear heavy, poorly broken in boots, or heavy boots that are great for other types of activities. And this example does show where gear can impact performance, but is not the same thing as a replacement for skill. In this scenario, we're assuming before you run the race that you're capable of running it to standard. Now, what happens if you are on the bleeding edge, where you are if the standard is 40 minutes, you're running a 39:45 pretty consistently. Technically, that's within standard, but you have a bad day, you eat Taco Bell the night before, or whatever you had makes you run 15 seconds slower, which over 5 miles is really only 3 seconds a mile, then you find yourself collecting the ire of your team. And so in that scenario, every little piece of equipment, every little attention to detail that you can put into it might keep you past, or might help you get past the finish line in time. But that is not the same thing as making a moral evaluation of such things. I don't mean to completely bring everything into the realm of morality, but there is something else at play that causes this to become a center of criticism. If you have a reputation of trying to compensate for a lack of discipline with gear, that might be what's actually happening here. People are attacking you, not because they don't think that your gear is useful, but because they don't trust that you are willing to put in the work to see the job done. Once again, if we go back to that interlude, are they your friends? Are they your community? Are they your team? Or are they your haters? Be careful on how much weight you put on both of those. Too little on those who genuinely have your best interest in mind, and you will miss the boat, and you will miss that sense of camaraderie that you're looking for. Too much on people who have no real consequence in your life, and you might find yourself in a bit of neuroticism. constantly confused and frustrated by the opinions of people you will never meet in the real world. So, what do we mean? So then what do we do then when we think about the subject of gear? Certainly, I am no person to say don't get the best things that you can for the mission that you are trying to accomplish. I wouldn't be original in this. I wouldn't be the kind of savant that the internet might never ever paint me to be, which I will be entirely all right with. But I am trying to illustrate the point. If you're having a hard time discerning whether or not the equipment that you're evaluating is going to meet the standards, look back to the standard. And if you are unsure, while we have Hanlon's razor, which argues if when you are faced with a decision, never attribute to malice what can be explained with incompetence, or Occam's razor, if you're unsure of the answer, the most likely answer is the one that requires the least amount of assumptions, we might have another razor here. If you are unsure of whether the gear is up to the task, assume that it isn't until you can prove otherwise. So, skill issues versus gear and acquisition. Although we will talk about, and we can talk about, how better gear will help you get better, and we'll use that in the second part of this second half. The first part begins like this. If you listen to the world's top competition shooters, and I've been around, and I've heard this conversation come from great names who will not go named in case they don't want to be for whatever reason, except for Josh Freilich, a great shooter. I have heard him say this. I have heard others who have been in that cutting upper edge of the 3-gun and the competition world. And while those outside will look in and might say, well, they have all this wonderful gear, they're sponsored by these companies, they get all this stuff, I want to remind you something that they have said, not only to me, but to the internet, to the world at large. Do not be distracted by chasing gear as you're developing skill. You want to only acquire gear, and hopefully I'm not butchering this completely, only acquire gear at a pace that matches your skill development. At the beginning, and I can use this in my own experience, which I did the wrong thing, and I certainly am not the only one, but I certainly did the wrong thing. Do not wait to start competing until you have all the right stuff. Let me rephrase that. Do not wait to go start competing in the sport that you want to compete in until you have all the right gear. And there are two reasons for this. One of them is the best reason, and that is the community. In all of my experiences with both 3-gun and USPSA, if you show up to a match and you're new at what you're doing, and you bring that humility with you, that you say, hey, I want to do this, I don't know what I'm doing, somebody there will take you under their wing and help you figure out the sport. Not only will they help you figure out the sport, but very often, if you're missing a piece of equipment, they very well might let you borrow theirs. This isn't, we are not obligated to borrow other people's gear, but it is a consistency I have seen in the shooting community. And so that is one side. The other side is you don't know what you don't know until you figure it out. And so if you're going to start shooting competition, this is not original to me, but this is advice that has been passed on to me that I wish I followed better on. Do not wait to start competing. Instead, start now and then acquire gear as you go. So that is the first part of this argument. The second one is that I think there is something to do with skill that goes into gear evaluation and selection. A person who is more skilled is more likely to make better selection of their gear. It doesn't mean that we might enjoy buying something new, a new pouch to go on a plate carrier, a new light to go on a rifle, a new suppressor, a new magazine, you can go on, a new pair of pants. Prism, I hope you can find some more of this multicam, because I'm still wearing these even though I half ruined them in a motorcycle accident. But what I'm saying with this one is there is a certain amount of joy that comes to getting new gear. And if we are to be honest about it, it might be a little bit of instant gratification, unless you got to order through the mail, whatever. Or there is a certain sense of progress. That is not a bad thing. sometimes a small amount of progress or a small amount of felt progress in the world of equipment will help you get over the resistance to going out and becoming skilled at the thing that you want to be good at, whether it's CQB, long-range shooting, or 3-gun. But if you use that gear as a crutch, and I'll explain this way in a way that you might not have considered. If you use that gear as a crutch, then it will get in your way. This is how I would expect, or I have seen, gear being used as a crutch in my own life. I want to go do the thing. I want to go film a video, run a race, shoot a thing, whatever. I want to go learn how to do something. And I tell myself that I can't do that until I have a certain piece of equipment. Now, whether or not I can learn the principles or become proficient in it or otherwise is not even part of my mental equation. But rather, I think to myself, oh man, it'd be great if I could do that. I'd really want to do that. It's beneficial for my life or whatever, whether it's rucking or running or whatever. And I'll use rucking as an example. And so I tell myself, I cannot get better at rucking until I have the best Mystery Ranch pack or the perfect rucksack. Okay, the perfectly packed rucksack, the perfectly colored and developed rucksack, whatever it is. What you will find, and what I have found, is that when I put gear in the way of trying to achieve something, I don't have the right oven to learn how to bake. I don't have the right camera to learn how to shoot photography. I don't have the right gear to learn how to do the thing that I want to do. What I'm doing is I'm giving myself an out. I am allowing myself some way to desire the thing, to enjoy the desire of the thing without actually having to do it. I am giving myself an excuse for why I am not pursuing the thing that I am telling myself that I want to do. And that is, again, similar to the episode that we published last week on conspiracy theory, where I believe the true danger lies in lying to ourselves, no pun intended, that we can somehow enjoy the thing without actually doing it. Gear is a similar issue. We've all met people and we all know the caricature of a person who isn't able to perform to the standard but kind of makes excuses for themselves because they think they have the right gear. Now, if we were to be serious with ourselves, and if we were serious with that person, we would recognize that they are not really participating in the same thing that we want to do. A person who clones an AR-15 or an M4 or an M4A1 Block 2 or whatever the nomenclature is not the same thing as a person who carries that firearm in the line of duty or in a gunfight, in the war. We know this inherently, but we let it bother us all the time. The gear that other people have should not be a bother to you. The gear that other people have should not be your concern unless they're a part of your community or you just want to hate on them. That is the simplest and most common example of what we've seen. I've seen pages pop up in social media whose sole purpose is to rag on individuals who have something that they don't, or even whether or not they know how to use it doesn't even matter. And we run into this cyclical problem. Going back to the question, and I need to zero it back in. Can you solve a skill issue with gear? No, but it does help. It can help you get there. In the earlier example I gave, I talked about how this small feeling of progress that comes with getting a new piece of kit can oftentimes be the motivation that pushes us to do the next thing, to take the next step in a journey that we want to travel down on. It can also, though, be wielded by our own selves like a crutch, an excuse not to do the thing. You want to go on a cross-country motorcycle ride and you don't have the highest, nicest BMW? Well, then don't even try because you're never going to fit in. Joke's on you. 2013, if you are not on a 2016, if you were not on a BMW and you went to Overland, people noticed because you weren't like everybody else. It didn't make that bike better. Hey, it's a shot. So we have the double-edged sword of gear as a form of motivation. The other thing that it can do, and it can do in spades, is if you are learning a skill and the gear that you have is causing you frustration, making a small improvement in what you own might help you get past that problem. A more accurate rifle may not make you a better shooter in the sense of merely possessing it makes you better at shooting, but it might be able to help you become better at the skill so long as you are willing to put in the work. And there goes the hitch. Where we typically see this criticism leveled is it is a veiled way of saying, hey, I know what you want, but you're not doing it, you're posing. That is very dangerous at becoming a hater. And so I will return to my interlude and I will return to the conclusion. So much of what we deal with when it comes to gear selection ends up taking part in the court of public opinion. This might happen within the confines of your squad in Ranger Battalion, or it might happen on the great aperture that is social media. Remember, you uploaded the photo, people might talk about it. And so there are really only two groups of people whose opinions about it that are likely to be vocalized. Those we see as our friends, those who are in our community, and the haters. If I don't know you and you're criticizing my gear, I am not obligated to respond to you. I'm not even obligated to defend myself. That is the way that we treat each other. It might sound a little cruel, it might be a little short-sighted, but generally speaking, that's how we work. When I see somebody that I know get something new and they're happy about it, can I not be happy for them? Do I think it's the smartest, most tactically proficient, specific thing? Does that matter to me in that scenario? Or am I thankful and happy that they are figuring out and pursuing something that they're good at? The inverse to this is advice. If you ask for somebody advice and you ignore it to their face and then expect them to approve of your decision, you might be acting like an asshole. So, to wrap it up, to close it off, the conversation about gear in gun culture is very oftentimes contentious. It's contentious in that uncomfortable way where it doesn't really seem serious, but it sort of is taken seriously. Taken seriously by who? If you've got AOR1 from head to toe, do I think you're cool? Maybe. It certainly might add something to it. I might go, that's some neat kit, but that's not the same thing as saying, I like who you are. It doesn't mean that I'm going to invite you onto the team. If we have this world that we live in, this metaphorical example of the 1980s action hero where you got the helicopter coming in and it's landing in your little 40 acres of your backyard and it says, hey, you, I need you to put a team together because we're going to go fight the communists that took over the American government. Hey, I need you to put a team together, and here's a bunch of dossiers we've put together. We've gathered a bunch of guys that think that might be candidates, and I go, all right, I've got a few of my own. Let's see who you got on deck. If you show up with a Springfield XD, probably not going to select you. Is it because I think the gun is a bad gun? No. It just, weirdly enough, carries its own attitude. So, that being the case, in case that landmine at the end really threw you for a loop, gear is a weird thing. Poorly assembled gear can certainly be the identifier of someone who is either A, new at what they're doing, or B, lazy. Well-maintained gear or well-used gear are oftentimes an identifier, but not a guarantee that the person that you're talking about or talking to has their shit together, has their skill development. Don't ever mistake gear for skill, but it can be useful in making evaluations. Well, if this episode of the Redacted Culture Cast has caught your interest, we will be doing some actual gear reviews coming out. And if you want to subscribe to this channel or share it with your friends, that's how we're going to grow. If you go over to us on Instagram, it is at redactedllc.com. And if you want to support Obsidian Arms, you can go over to them at obsidianarms.com. You join our newsletter called The Dead Drop. We will include discount codes for you for Obsidian Arms. And if you go over to redactedculture.locals.com, you can find our version of Patreon. I do some Q&A once a week, and that is just kind of the do you want to support the channel location. That being said, go forth and conquer.